Ever feel trapped? Like you're stuck in a deal you never signed up for?
Ooh, I like where this is going.
Today, we're diving deep into Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State.
Classic.
And let me tell you, he's got some strong opinions on contracts, especially the one we supposedly have with the state. Rothbard was an economist and philosopher who really went after the very core of government power. His writing, sharp, witty, and still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely. What makes Rothbard so interesting is he doesn't just nitpick at policies.
Right.
He goes for the jugular, questions why we even accept the state's authority in the first place.
And that's where things get really interesting. He compares the state to, get this, a mafia.
Bold move.
Demanding protection money.
It's a powerful analogy when you think about it.
Right.
The state extracts wealth from its citizens through taxation.
Under threat of punishment if you don't pay up.
Exactly. And then claims to use that money, that wealth, to provide, essential services, security. Rothbard's asking, where's the real agreement in that exchange?
Like, did we actually sign up for this? It's like that scene in those medieval movies. The king's men just roll into a village and demand their share of the harvest, call it a tax.
It feels more like
legalized theft.
Exactly. And Rothbard, he wants us to see that same dynamic playing out throughout history. He'd argue that just because we've dressed it up with fancier words, elections, laws, doesn't change the power imbalance at its core. It makes you wonder, have we ever truly consented to this whole arrangement, or have we just kind of inherited a system that we're expected to accept? No questions asked.
It's an interesting thought, right? And that brings us to a major sticking point for Rothbard. This idea of the common good.
Oh, here we go.
He is incredibly skeptical about that whole concept.
Yeah, he sees right through it.
He'd say there's always going to be conflicting interests within any society.
Of course.
And often that common good is just a nice, shiny label to benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else.
He'd argue that you can't force true cooperation, and a state that claims to know what's best for everyone, well, that's a dangerous idea.
Dangerous indeed.
It often ends up trampling on individual rights, desires, in the name of this abstract, collective.
It's like when a local government uses eminent domain to take someone's property for economic development. Next thing you know, it's a shopping mall that benefits some big developer, while pushing out families who've lived there, for generations.
The perfect example of how the common good can be a really dangerous illusion.
Right.
Rothbard wants us to ask, who is really benefiting from this? Who's making the decisions? And is this actually in the best interest of everyone, or just a select few who hold the power?
So if we're going with Rothbard's logic here, who's whispering in the state's ear, who's helping to maintain this whole system, he doesn't let intellectuals off the hook either. He says that intellectuals often act as, like, the state's unofficial PR team.
Interesting way to put it.
They provide the intellectual arguments to justify its power.
It's a symbiotic relationship, he argues.
Right.
Intellectuals, they gain prestige, influence, often funding from the state. And in return, the state gets legitimacy, a shield against criticism.
So you're saying some of the brightest minds are basically complicit in this system. That's a bit unsettling.
It is something to think about, for sure. When you have these great minds, these influential figures aligning themselves with state power, it becomes even harder for dissenting voices to be heard. Makes you question who gets to decide what's true, what's acceptable to even question in the first place.
It's like those scientists during the Cold War. They used their expertise to justify building up these massive nuclear arsenals, all in the name of national security. Was that really in the best interest of humanity, though? Or were there other, factors at play?
It's a slippery slope. That line between offering genuine expertise and just serving the state's interests, it can get very blurry. And Rothbard would argue that's exactly why we need to be so vigilant. Always question the assumptions, even when they're coming from authority figures.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got the state acting like a protector while taking its cut. We've got the idea of the common good, often used to benefit the powerful few. We've got intellectuals potentially propping up the system. And then there's war. You'd think war, with all its chaos and destruction, would weaken the state, right?
Seems logical.
Rothbard has a different take. He argues that war can actually strengthen a state's grip on power.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but think about it. When we're talking war, we're talking fear, uncertainty.
People are just looking for someone to keep them safe.
Exactly. And they're more willing to accept restrictions on their freedom if it means, security. It's like they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. Governments throughout history have used crises, whether real or perceived, to justify grabbing more control.
It's the oldest trick in the book.
It is. And wartime is a very convenient excuse to push through policies that in peacetime people would be like, hold on a second. Increased surveillance, censorship, limiting free speech, all justified in the name of national security.
It's like that saying, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Exactly.
Oh, wait, that's Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, he was onto something there.
He was ahead of his time.
The expansion of government surveillance after 9/11, I mean, that's a perfect example. Many of those temporary security measures, they're still around long after the initial threat is,
Gone. It's like scary to think about.
It is, and that's what Rothbard's warning us about. He's saying these emergency powers, once you give them to the state, good luck getting them back, the state apparatus, it just grows. Individual liberty, well, that often becomes collateral damage.
So we're always just one crisis away from, more authoritarian state.
That's the question Rothbard wants us to grapple with. It's this constant balancing act, right? Security versus freedom. But in Rothbard's view, the whole thing's rigged against individual liberty. He sees the state as inherently opposed to freedom. Every action it takes, he argues, involves some degree of coercion.
So even like taxes, regulations, all those everyday things, those are all forms of coercion.
Absolutely. Anytime the state dictates how you can use your property, spend your money, even what you're allowed to say or think, that's infringing on your individual liberty, in his view.
It's like, you can't have your cake and eat it, too.
Right. Except in this case, it's more like the state can't provide for everyone without controlling everyone. And that's really the heart of his argument. He believes that true freedom, like real freedom, it requires a fundamental shift away from state control and towards individual responsibility, voluntary cooperation.
Okay, so let's break this down. We've got the state acting like a protector, taking its cut. We've got the common good, which often benefits the powerful. We've got intellectuals potentially propping up this system. We've got war being used to increase state control. Then Rothbard throws in this whole other concept, his take on class struggle.
It's interesting because when we typically talk about class struggle, we're thinking Marx, the workers versus the owners.
Like the classic haves and the have-nots. But Rothbard, he sees it differently. He says the real class struggle, it's not about who owns the factories anymore. It's about who controls the government.
So it's not about blue collar versus white collar. It's about
those in power versus everyone else. He calls it, are you ready for this? The ruling class.
The ruling class. So not just those who hold economic power, but those who control the levers of government itself. But hasn't it always been that way?
Power imbalances, they're nothing new. But Rothbard wants us to look beyond the traditional class lines, to recognize that the state itself creates a class division. Those who wield its power and those who are subject to it.
So it's less about who's in the factory and more about who's calling the shots from their cushy government offices.
Right, and those shots, those policies often benefit, the well-connected.
The ones who fund the campaigns scratch the right backs.
Exactly. A politician who pushes for regulations that make it harder for small businesses to compete but benefit these huge corporations, they might say they're fighting for the little guy. Who are they really serving? Or those government bailouts when the economy tanks. Who's getting bailed out?
Not my bank account, that's for sure.
Great. Is it the average person struggling to just keep their head above water? Or is it these corporations with their high-powered lobbyists?
It makes you think, is there even a point?
Rothbard wants us to see these power dynamics, to start asking who benefits, who decides. Is this system actually working for the majority or just reinforcing the power of a select few?
It's a bit disheartening when you put it like that.
It's a tough reality to face, but awareness is the first step, right?
So, okay, we've covered a lot. We've got this protector state taking its cut. We've got the common good debate, the role of intellectuals, the impact of war, and Rothbard's unique perspective on class struggle. He's not exactly giving the state a glowing review.
He's definitely not mincing words.
So where does he land? What's the solution?
Well, this is where Rothbard throws us a real curveball. His solution. Are you ready for this? He wants to abolish the state completely.
Wait, seriously? He doesn't want to just shrink it. He wants it gone.
Gone. He believes that the state is inherently coercive. It can't exist without some form of force, and that's fundamentally incompatible with true individual liberty.
Okay, I can already imagine the pushback on that one. No government, no rules, that's anarchy.
He anticipates those arguments. But he'd counter that a stateless society doesn't have to mean chaos. He envisions a world where essential services are provided through voluntary agreements, private institutions, the free market.
So instead of government-run services, it's all private. Private security, private courts, the whole shebang. That's a huge change.
It's a radical departure from what we're used to, but that's his point. Rothbard wants us to break free from the way we've been conditioned to think about how society has to be structured, to envision a world where individual freedom and responsibility reign supreme.
Whether you agree with Rothbard's vision of a stateless society or not, he forces us to confront some really fundamental questions. What is power? What are the legitimate limits of government? And can a truly free society actually exist?
And in today's world, a world grappling with increasing government overreach, surveillance, social control, those questions are more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Rothbard's Anatomy of the State is a powerful reminder to never stop questioning, to challenge assumptions, and to imagine alternative possibilities.
If you're looking for a book that will make you see the world in a new light, pick up a copy. It's a short read, but it packs a punch.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Murray Rothbard's thought-provoking work. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking those tough questions, and remember, the pursuit of knowledge and individual liberty, it's a journey, not a destination.